Today, on the 116th birthday of the Field and Garden Club, we're going to celebrate by telling you a story about how our club was born and how it grew. It begins in the year 1876, in the time of Queen Victoria, Charles Dickens, and Gilbert and Sullivan. The Civil War was just barely over. Women were wearing their hair, which was never cut, piled high on their heads. Their dresses had bustles, and wives addressed their husbands as Mr. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, in the year 1876, Lexington was a small rural village with 2,277 inhabitants and 418 dwellings. Farming was the principal occupation, and there were many farms and orchards. The chief products were hay, milk, fruit, and vegetables. The village had its own newspaper, the Lexington Minuteman, which began publication in 1871, and there was a fine free library, thanks to Mrs. Carey. It had only been a few years since herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs were driven right down Main Street on the way to markets in Brighton. But the railroad changed all that by running many freight cars as well as 8 passenger trains through the town daily. The principal transportation in Lexington was still horse and carriage over dirt-covered streets. In 1875, civic pride swelled as citizens prepared to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Battle on the Green by cleaning up and fixing up the village to receive its distinguished visitors, the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, and his cabinet. But in spite of all the work done around the town, a letter to the editor of the newspaper pointed out that the area in front of the railroad depot was still most unattractive, and a committee was formed to improve the vacant land. It soon became apparent that a permanent association was needed to improve our streets and squares by planting ornamental trees and shrubs, and within a month the Lexington Field and Garden Club was organized with Matthew Merriam as president. Chapter 2 takes place in 1887. Mr. Merriam is preparing to leave the office he has held since 1876. He is working on his final report to the club and has graciously agreed to share some of his thoughts with us today.
As I leave the office of president, I have been asked to review our activities of the past 11 years. I know we organized the first garden club in America, so as its president, my report should be noteworthy. But where do I begin? It was a beautiful day, that May 17th in 1876 when we first met, and I've often wondered if weather played a part in the large, enthusiastic group who were present for our birth. I'm proud that I was not only present for the birth of our club, but that it was born in my house. The group voted immediately to accept our preamble as presented, but it took quite a bit longer for us to settle on a name. When we did, I think we made a wise choice: the Lexington Field and Garden Club. The name well describes the purpose of our organization. I do believe I was the one that suggested the name. At one of our first meetings, we voted to appoint committees to check on the slow growth of Mr. Rayner's trees on Main Street, work on ways to improve the grounds around the railroad station, and plan a field trip, all in that order. Mr. Rayner was one of our founders, you know, so I imagine that's why his trees received top priority. But they are flourishing now and providing much-needed shade along Main Street. Rather humble beginnings, but I look back and marvel at our accomplishments. Just a month after our first meeting, we took our first trip to Shaker Glen. It met with such success that we have continued these field trips each year. They have taken us to the surrounding countryside and as far away as New Hampshire. Great knowledge and pleasure has been gained from these trips, as well as from the series of lectures we've sponsored, and they've added a nice tidy sum of money to our treasury, too. From the very beginning, we have concentrated our efforts on improving the looks of the very necessary but very ugly train and freight area, which dominates the center of our village. Through persuasion, prodding, and yes, a few friendly battles with the railroad and town officials, we've improved this area greatly. The land in front of the station has been cleared, graded, and planted with trees. But not much more needs to be done, and I anticipate we will be working on this problem for many years to come. What a fine job our Village Improvement Committee continues to do in beautifying the islands at Hancock and Bedford Streets, Pleasant and Massachusetts Avenue, and Lincoln and Concord Streets. I must remember also to mention that through our efforts, estate owners have opened their gardens for tours for townspeople each year. And oh yes, the trees. The many trees we've planted through Lexington over the years. I'll plan to finish my talk by reviewing our work last year, for 1886 was a banner year for our club. We got our first tree warden due to our efforts, but our greatest accomplishment in all of our 11 years was beautifying the common. We turned the hay-covered field, often filled with cows, into a beautiful, dignified, historical park. Many townspeople were opposed to any changes being made there, so we owe a debt of gratitude to James Monroe and his committee for their tireless efforts which made this happen. I am indeed proud to have served as the club's first president and must thank all of our members for making these wonderful things happen. I know the club will grow and prosper under the leadership of George Whiting. Oh, why, here he comes now. Good morning, George.
Good morning, Matthew.
I've been mulling over my speech for the annual meeting of the Garden Club.
That's a coincidence. I've just been reading Miss Whitman's minutes in preparation for assuming office. Our first field trip in 1876 was amazing, wasn't it? Especially since we had just organized. Over 50 people were present at the rendezvous at Shaker Glen, where a tent was pitched and a flag was raised. It was a wonderful day. We botanized in both the upper and lower Glen, with much merriment and good food under lovely trees. Remember our wives jumping over the stones in their long skirts, and my wife leading the singing coming home?
Yes, I do. I remember it with great pleasure, and all of our other field trips, especially the Laurel trips to New Hampshire, where your family in Wilton served as hosts so many times.
Yes, I have been delighted to see how much our group enjoyed my nephew David's tours of the family dairy farm. We definitely plan to continue these annual Laurel trips. I'm sorry you missed our last trip, Matthew, when we had 150 people on special trains, which gave us the opportunity to stop wherever we desired. There was great sociability and fun, and of course my wife led the singing, which all seemed to enjoy.
Yes, I do regret missing it. From all reports, it was one of our best.
I was a bit concerned over our secretary, Miss Whitman's report. Listen to what she wrote. Quote, "It was the hottest day of the year, but the train rushed by, making it bearable. The time was spent in social chat and fun, reaching a climax of intoxication after excessive indulgence in drinks provided by Mr. Whiting. We left the train at Jefferson and traveled by barges to Mountain House, where comical efforts in the strong wind were made to take our picture. After climbing Wachusett Mountain, we stopped on our return trip to gather laurel, so the train cars were decorated with laurel so profusely, one felt as if one was in a bower of lovely flowers." End of quote. That's a good description of this trip, but I assure you, the drinks were well wadded, and the enthusiasm of the group was due to congeniality rather than intoxication.
As you know, George, Miss Whitman is witty and full of fun and a joy to work with. Since I was unable to go on that field trip, I'll never know whether the record shows Miss Whitman's wit or the fact of the matter. Let posterity judge. But do continue the field trips. They have meant so much to our club members, and my best wishes to you for the year ahead.
After George Whiting left office in 1889, the elaborate picnics and all-day field trips stopped, although several attempts were made to revive them. The club was busy in other directions, however. In 1891, Miss Alice Carey deeded the land at the intersection of the roads to Concord and Lincoln to the club with the stipulation that the club assume responsibility for the caravan and see to it that it be kept as a public park known as Hastings Park. This they did until 1897, when they sold it to the town for $1. The telephone had come to town in 1882 with 6 subscribers and continued to expand all over town. Citizens watched the pole raising and installation of the apparatus with great interest. By the turn of the century, the newspaper was reporting that the Garden Club had 60 persons in its membership, and the population of the town was nearing 4,000. In 1900, there was electricity in the town buildings, most of the street lights, and in some of the homes. Main Street and Monument Street had been renamed Massachusetts Avenue. On April 19, 1900, the beautiful Hayes Fountain with its statue of the Minuteman was dedicated, and the first streetcars started operating. People were just crazy about bicycles. It seemed almost everyone had one, and there were numerous complaints about the reckless way some cyclists operated to the endangerment of pedestrians. There was one automobile in town, and John Hutchinson owned it. It is now 1910. I would like to introduce you to Frederick L. Emery, who has been president of the Garden Club since 1904. Mr. Emery is a 36-year-old patent attorney with offices in Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. In Mr. Emery's presidency, the club has made great and lasting improvements to the center of town, especially the area around the depot. He was a young man with unlimited energy, perseverance, and persistence, coupled with an unfailing determination to beautify the center of Lexington. In order to rid the center of the gas company's abandoned buildings, coal bins, and unsightly brick chimney stacks, which adjoined the railroad property, he spent 6 months negotiating the sale of this gas company property to the railroad. Despite the railroad's reluctance to spend money on such a project, he finally accomplished his mission. The railroad not only purchased this land, but accepted the rigid restrictions made by the town for its use, all at Mr. Emery's suggestion. This was one of Mr. Emery's greatest accomplishments and forever changed the face of Lexington Center. Another major accomplishment was landscaping around town buildings, including Cary Library. We find Mr. Emery in his study talking on the phone with Charles Parker, editor of the Lexington Minuteman.
Mr. Parker, Fred Emery speaking. My attention has been called to your article in last week's Minuteman, in which you referred to the expense of town hall improvements and the station area improvements. You stated that the town couldn't afford to expend money on such improvements when the tax rate is so high. The principal expense in the railroad and coal yard area was borne by the railroad, and all the other expenses were met by private contributions, so that the town has not spent 1 cent. I would appreciate your paper correcting this error in the next issue. And will you commend the townspeople for contributing over $4,000 towards these projects? Thank you, Mr. Parker. Make sure you give the Lexington Field and Garden Club the credit it is due. I have just enough time to make another call. Operator, get me the chief of police. Mr. Franks? Frederick Emery of the Field and Garden Club calling. Did you speak to the Board of Health about a system of taking up garbage as we discussed? Action must be taken soon, for the filth from the careless methods of handling now in vogue cannot be tolerated. Thank you. Also, I should appreciate your persuading Mr. McCarthy not to dump all of his straw from the stables for airing near the sidewalk on Miriam Street. It is untidy, odorous, and at different times has blown as far from 50 to 100 feet. I would appreciate your action on this. Oh yes, 2 other matters, Mr. Franks, while I have you on the line. Will you see that one of the tubs we provided for trash is placed at Town Hall? Debris is all around the building. Yes, and would you post officers in the center to determine whose horses are ruining the trees? And check on those manure piles near Miriam Street. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Franks.
Fred Emery served as president of the club for 13 years until 1917, after which time he asked the executive board to be excused from further duties. The club graciously allowed him 1 whole year of relaxation and then prevailed on him to assume his office once more. This time he served from 1918 to 1928. It is now 1923. And Mr. Emery has become a member of the Town Planning Board in order to strengthen his ability to pursue his own ideas of a more beautiful town. We find him now in his office on Congress Street in Boston, dictating letters to his secretary.
Good morning, Miss Parkman. Before I leave for New York, I must take care of some pressing garden club business. I was appalled at the road work done in East Lexington. So my first letter goes to Superintendent of Public Works, William Scammon. Dear Mr. Scammon, in doing the street work on Mass Avenue in East Lexington, can you not arrange to have the borders between the street and the sidewalks loamed and grassed as a part of the street work? To fix up a street and neglect the borders is like giving a man a new suit of clothes and leaving him with shoes that are run down at the heels, broken out at the sides, and unblacked. Will you let me know what the possibilities are in this respect? If it is impossible to do anything by approaching it in this way through you, I would like to go before the selectmen in a broader way. I would be glad of your suggestions. Very truly yours. Next letter to the Boston and Maine Railroad. Attention, Mr. Fifield. Dear Mr. Fifield, this is to thank you for your courtesy in stopping work on the painting of Lexington Station in order that the original color might be substituted. The building, as remodeled, has been quite a landmark in Lexington. It would be most unfortunate to have its attractive architecture impaired by an improper color scheme. Very truly yours. I'm pleased the railroad is cooperating so well with us these days. The next letter is to Mr. Custance, town offices. Dear Mr. Custance, to give you a better idea of what my scheme for Hastings Park is, I enclose a sketch of a design for this, worked out by Mr. Horton, who, whatever may be said of his habits at town meeting, is a thorough student, even a great student of landscape work. His plan dignifies the narrow apex of the triangle. Also, I would scoop out a lot of the dirt you have filled in at the lower end and spread it at the back. The most monotonous thing in this world is uniformity, and to get a variable contour there can make a beautiful effect. May I hear from you in this matter? Very truly yours. I wonder why I haven't heard from the Historical Society regarding my proposal for correcting the deplorable conditions on Old Belfry Hill by surrounding it with a fence and covering up the terrible wood carvings with old shingles or clapboards. I'll check on that on my return. While I'm away, will you designate one file to all Garden Club matters so they will be more accessible to me. Goodbye, Miss Parkman. I'll see you on Friday.
In 1928, Mr. Emery once again asked to be relieved of his duties, and so the board voted to extend to Mr. Emery a vote of thanks for his many years of untiring service as president. And then he thought he was free to pursue his other interests of amateur photography, hiking with the Appalachian Mountain Club, and golf. But he became president again in 1930. Our town had grown by then to be almost 10,000 people. It is now 1933.
33.
Buses have replaced the streetcars, and we have a town swimming pool. Carey Memorial Building was dedicated in 1928, and the new town office building on Mass Avenue was completed and is now occupied. Mr. Emery is chairman of the planning board. He is still constantly writing letters and phoning the railroad to keep the area around the depot attractive and presentable. Here he comes now.
Do you have a few minutes to talk about the latest projects of the Garden Club?
Yes, I have a few minutes. I am especially pleased to see that work has begun just today on our newest project on the Buckman Tavern grounds, made possible by an appropriation of $550 from the club for digging the flower beds and planting shrubs. Am I going too fast for you? This has been long in the works. In 1929, Mr. Arthur Shurtleff, the famous Boston landscape architect, prepared designs for restoration of the old-fashioned gardens. It is my hope to make an herb garden there that will be the most complete one to be found in this part of the country.
I understand you've been president of the Garden Club for a total of 26 years. Would you care to comment on some of the important accomplishments of the Garden Club during your years of service?
I've aged well. I'm proud of our record. Look around you and you will see many accomplishments. The removal of a multitude of utility lines coming into town. Beautiful Westview Cemetery, patterned after one I saw in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Grading and planting street borders. Developing Hastings Park. And even keeping the hedges clipped across the street on Muzzy, to name only a few.
What do you feel most proud of?
I would say my greatest contribution is the improvement found in this area around the station. You are too young to remember the deplorable conditions found here. And look at it now, with clean grounds and the newly renovated station. I expect this small plot of land in front of our station to become a park before I leave office. I've worked hard for 25 years on this project, and it is finally coming to fruition. I'm proud also of the trees, the many trees we've planted throughout Lexington, which will be enjoyed for generations to come.
Thank you, Mr. Emery. I'm very interested in the work you've done.
Good day, and remember to quote me properly. I was displeased with the Minuteman's article last week. I was misquoted.
Yes, sir.
Shortly after this interview, Mr. Emery died unexpectedly in New York City at age 66. The town went into mourning and flags flew at half-staff for this public-spirited man who had done so much for the town he loved. His will provided the means to continue his interest in civic betterment projects, even after he could no longer be involved. He left $5,000 to the town, with the interest from the fund to be spent by the Garden Club to beautify his Lexington. Work at the depot continued through the years, and the little park was eventually named in his honor. The Garden Club placed a bronze plaque as a memorial to the man who had devoted such a large part of his life to improving this little plot of land. The next chapter takes place in 1934. The community is feeling the effects of the Great Depression. The real world is no fun at all, and people are finding inexpensive ways to amuse themselves. Weekly band concerts on the lawn at Buckman Tavern help. Radio programs present a wonderful world of make-believe, with programs like Burns and Allen, Charlie McCarthy, Jack Benny, and Fred Allen. At the movies, Shirley Temple, Fred Astaire, and Ginger Rogers are taking everyone's minds off their troubles. The Garden Club is a marvelous source of fun and inexpensive amusement. The Saturday afternoon field trips were very popular. Children are welcome, and the trips have turned into family affairs. There are walks to study mushrooms, search out wildflowers, look for birds, and in the winter, they put on boots and snowshoes and tramp to Tophet Swamp to gather greens and red berries for wreath making. Helen Webster has now been president of the club for 1 year. She is an ardent herbalist with a very large and famous backyard garden. She is one of the nation's outstanding authorities on herbs, and visitors flock to her garden from all over the country. She is the author of many pamphlets and books on herbs and was asked to be a consultant in the restoration of the kitchen garden at Mount Vernon. Besides raising 5 children, she is an active volunteer in many Lexington organizations. We are about to visit her in her home across the street on Mass Avenue, where she has just returned from the annual meeting of the Garden Club.
I rejoice in the new faces, new life, and new focus found in our club this year, all brought about by my persuading the former garden section of the Outlook Club to join our ranks. Now they call themselves the Morning Study Group of the Lexington Field and Garden Club. When I approached the ladies 2 years ago, they said they would gain very little and simply be supplying energy to a very dull organization. To which I replied, all the better to have so much to give. But they postponed joining until this year. They finally accepted our invitation. They have been efficient, artistic, and almost indispensable part of our club. In just 1 year, these ladies, along with their husbands, have revitalized our whole organization. Before this group joined our ranks, work centered around improving the town. Now, for the first time, we have added new dimensions through the serious study of horticulture and flower arranging, and have reached out to share our bounty of knowledge and talent by providing flowers, fruit, and vegetables to the sick and lonely in Boston through our participation in the Fruit and Flower Mission. These ladies also brought with them an intense interest in herbs, which has existed since I chaired their successful herbal tea at Buckman Tavern 2 years ago. Mrs. Dane said, since then, they've been making merry on herbs of every kind, rubbing, snuffing, sniffing, cooking, and growing them. And they have spread that interest throughout our club. We continue to work on projects started by our beloved Fred Emery, but have found Mr. Shirtleff's plans for landscaping at Buckman Tavern just too elaborate and expensive. Our assistance with work at Hastings Park would please Fred, and of course we are always mindful of the Depot Square area. As I told the club members at our annual meeting this morning, we've accomplished great things in just 1 year. But as I used to say to the Girl Scouts when giving them their rewards, we have done well, but we still have far to go, and we will go far. Poor Hollis. I must prepare his lunch and then spend some time working on my book before I leave the Scout for a Scout meeting this afternoon.
Helen Webster finished her book in 1939. It was called Herbs, How to Grow Them and How to Use Them, and it had 7 printings. After her death, an herb garden at the kitchen door of Buckman Tavern was created in her memory by her friends in the Garden Club. Proceeds from the sale of her book were given to the club by her family for the upkeep of the garden. Now, in 1939, Professor Stephen Hamlin is the president of the club. A reserved and modest man, he teaches horticulture at Harvard. He is the former director of the Botanic Garden there and is currently the director of the Lexington Botanic Garden. He misses no opportunity to use his skill as an educator as well as his love of plants to increase the knowledge and enthusiasm of everyone around him on his favorite subject. Oh, here he comes now, walking down Forest Street. Professor, do you have time to talk to us?
To know about the Garden Club. It's a thriving, enthusiastic group now, thanks to Helen Webster. What a dynamo that woman is. She breathed new life into the old Field and Garden Club all right. Before her day, club members seldom, if ever, talked about gardens or flowers. I couldn't even get them interested in horticulture. But there's been a big change. The club meets regularly now, at least 6 times a year, and we have speakers on subjects of interest to gardeners. The club has started publishing a yearbook, listing the meetings and members' names and committees. We have joined the State Federation of Garden Clubs, too. Now the club has 216 members, and Willard Brown has designed a beautiful seal for us. In it, he depicts the different aspects of club interests. He says it's the only seal in the country with a dandelion so prominently placed. He may have included the dandelion because he prided himself on growing the biggest weeds in town, and he brought one to the club to prove it. The club now has a civic section, which is responsible for projects to preserve and improve the local landscape, a continuation of the work Fred Emery was doing. And the field section plans walks every month for the study of natural history. The garden section studies garden plants and spreads knowledge on how to grow them. The meetings of the morning study group are for serious study, and members write scholarly papers on horticultural subjects. The evening group is mostly men. Right now, I'm on my way to the Botanic Gardens at 93 Hancock Street. We have 11 acres there to grow, test, and display hardy herbaceous plants. It's devised to be of value to students of horticulture at Harvard and also to Garden Club members. It's a grand site with a marsh and a brook for our bog garden, and oak woods for our wildflowers, and a small hill for our rock garden. We also have a big perennial border and a section for native plants. When the Botanic Garden in Cambridge closed in 1929, Harvard allowed me to bring a portion of each of the plants and 5,000 packets of seeds to this new garden. It is open every day and admission is free. Come along with me. I'd like to show it to you.
Professor Hamlin was president again in 1946 and 47. By 1949, he had closed the doors of the Botanic Garden, and the land was sold to a commercial nursery to be called Lexington Gardens. One of the many books he wrote was on the cultivation of wildflowers, which he co-authored with Catherine Taylor, who was at that time the president of the New England Wildflower Preservation Society. And so we come to the 1940s. World War II is raging, and Garden Club members are doing whatever they can to aid the war effort. The population in this town has risen to 13,000. Citizens are attending lectures on air raid precautions and buying defense bonds, learning to put up with blackouts and deal with rationing. Rationing created the little books of stamps that limited the food, gas, or shoes each person could buy, and housewives needed the stamps as well as cash to buy what they needed. Well-dressed women never went out without a hat and gloves. Unfortunately, silk went to war, so women painted their legs to look like the stockings they could no longer buy. The Garden Club was worried about foreign invasions too. In this case, Japanese beetles, which made an appearance in this country in 1912 and were chewing their way up the coast from New Jersey. And also Dutch elm disease, which was destroying trees all over New England. 60% of the commercially grown vegetable crop was taken by the government to feed the troops, so there was a patriotic need for home gardens. The Garden Club responded to this need by sponsoring a series of free lectures on gardening, practical advice for anyone who wanted to learn to grow their own vegetables in their home gardens. We call them victory gardens. Nitrogen and other chemical fertilizers went to war also, and the club is urging citizens to build compost piles. Clem Ferguson, president of the Garden Club, helps show the way. He has an impressive vegetable garden behind his house. His big compost pile is hidden behind dwarf fruit trees, espaliered on a wire fence. Surrounding the garden are at least 15 varieties of grapes trained to a split rail fence. In addition to all of this, he has built a greenhouse in which he has more than 200 orchids. I believe he's there now. Let's go and talk with him.
Before we start talking about Garden Club, I want to show you this. It's a Vanda orchid, one of my favorites. Actually, I have so many orchids, it's hard to choose amongst them. But you want to know about the club. The board has decided that in view of all of the difficulties in transportation, you know, gas is so scarce and buses run only intermittently, and the many calls on our members for war and defense work, there will only be 3 club meetings this year. But the Garden Club is strong and healthy in spite of these difficulties. Mrs. Bernard Weber is chairman of a committee to support the hospital at Camp Devens. They have raised money to plant flower gardens and shade trees around the buildings. All during the year, they decorate the wards and recreation halls by sending flowers regularly to help cheer up our wounded soldiers. The club also has a defense committee. Their purpose is to bring experienced and inexperienced gardeners together to solve problems. Food preservation is a part of it also, and they have sponsored many home canning demonstrations. A couple of years ago, when George Cyrano couldn't get any labor to help him with his apple crop, volunteers from the club went to his farm on Lincoln Street and helped him pick, grade, and pack his apples for the market. We did the whole thing for him. The club has continued its work at Emery Park in the last few years. Marie Cook, Professor Hamlin, and Minnie Glynn have cleaned up the whole area. They have planted shrubs and trees and reseeded the grass. The club placed stone posts around the park and purchased chains to complete the enclosure. It is to be hoped that now the vandals will leave the park alone and that citizens will help keep the area free from trash and litter. so that we may all have a place of beauty in the center of our town. As Mary Duffy, our club secretary, said, let us also remember that beautiful flowers and shrubs can march side by side in our victory gardens to help our morale and thus hasten the day of victory.
The last chapter brings us to 1947. The war is finally over and the town is adjusting to the many servicemen returning home. The town needs more houses, another elementary school, a new high school, new streets, new water mains. The list seems endless. 1947 marks a turning point for Lexington. It is a time when the town changes from a small country town to the beginnings of a real metropolitan suburb. There is much talk about the relocation of Route 128, which at present comes from Waltham through the center of town to Woburn Street. From there it goes on through Woburn and Stoneham to hook up with a new 4-lane highway in Wakefield. Town officials are anxious to hurry the process of deciding the exact route so as to ease traffic congestion in the center. Marie Hancock Cook is now the president of the Garden Club. Mrs. Cook is a genuine artist in flower arranging, and she teaches and exhibits constantly, not only in Lexington, but at garden clubs, museums, and flower shows all over this region. For 5 years, she traveled to New York City to attend 6-day courses in flower show arranging and flower show judging. She graduated from this program in 1934. In 1937, she began the first judging course at Horticultural Hall and ran that for 5 years. She was instrumental in starting the first flower show school for the Massachusetts Federation of Garden Clubs in 1946. As we catch up with this busy lady, we find her at Buckman Tavern, where a standard flower show is in progress. She is talking with her invited guest, another teacher of flower arranging. Let's go and listen in.
Look at this arrangement. Isn't it lovely? Notice the unusual container. Perfect proportion, line, color, overall design. It was done by one of my new pupils who won a blue ribbon at the flower show at Horticultural Hall this spring. Oh, whenever one of my club members exhibits at a flower show, people know it's one of my pupils. I am so delighted that we have been walking away with so many blue ribbons recently. But, oh dear, look at this arrangement over here. I hasten to say that this arranger is new in town, and she's assured me she's entered flower shows before. Oh, she has ruined perfectly lovely flowers by stuffing them into an ordinary container. I always tell my pupils they must allow for a butterfly to flit in and out between the flowers of their arrangements. I must encourage this arranger to enter one of my classes. At the very first meetings with my beginner classes, I point out that there are interesting materials besides flowers that can be found around us to enhance our arrangements. And I urge each member of the class to look for unusual containers at rummage sales or even in their attics, just as I have done. As you know, only a few arrangers will have exhibit quality work, but I am delighted to see that through my efforts, so many lovely arrangements that are appearing in our homes in Lexington. As I have said, vegetables are the food necessary for the body, but flowers are the food for the soul.
Now, when my husband Chester and I were talking the other day, he asked me how I'd like to be remembered. I've been fortunate to receive so many honors during my life. I've been working hard on civic improvements, such as Emery Park. But regardless of all of this, it is my hope that in the future, when Marie Hancock Cook's name is mentioned, a dedicated, enthusiastic, and inspiring teacher will come to mind. A teacher who enriched the lives of many by showing them the way to bring joy and beauty to their homes and lives through the art of flower arranging. And especially with the members of the Lexington Field and Garden Club, I hope that when they win their blue ribbons and admire a beautiful arrangement, that they will think of me and remember that I was the Garden Club president who felt there was too much emphasis on horticulture and not enough on flower arranging, and I did something about it.
Mrs. Cook developed her expertise in period arrangements. She could tell at a glance if the container, the flowers chosen, or some part of the design was inappropriate for the period being represented. To honor her achievements, the Massachusetts Federation of Garden Clubs established an award in her honor, calling it the Marie Hancock Cook Certificate of Merit for Achievement in Traditional Flower Arrangements, to be presented at the New England Spring Flower Shows. A few years later, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society bestowed their highest honor on her by presenting her with the Society's large gold medal. And so we must close our storybook for now. Mrs. Cook's chapter has brought us through the first 75 years of the club's history, where we must stop for today, although there is still much more to tell. Since 1950, the club has continued to thrive and expand, with the formation of Wednesday Workshop in the 60s, and most recently, a revived evening group. As we look back over our history, we can see that many of the activities of today are the same as those of yesterday, and in addition, we've added some new ones. We feel that our early leaders would applaud our efforts and be pleased that the Lexington Field and Garden Club is still healthy and vital as we head for the year 2000, still remembering to plant the trees and keep Lexington a beautiful place to live.